I never expected to encounter Jesus while praying in Mecca. In fact, if someone had told me that a few months earlier, I would have laughed at them. I had gone to Mecca carrying a burden I had hidden from almost everyone. I wasn't looking for Christianity. I wasn't searching for a new religion. I wasn't even sure what I was searching for. I simply wanted an answer. But that night, after I whispered one desperate prayer, something happened that I could never explain away. And when I opened my eyes, I saw someone standing in front of me. My name is Yusuf. At least, that is the name I will use in this dramatized testimony. I was raised in a deeply religious family. From childhood, I was taught that faith was something you inherited, protected, and never questioned. My father was a respected man. He believed strongly in tradition, family honor, obedience, and religious commitment. He expected his children to follow the path he had followed. And I did. For years, I never questioned anything. I prayed. I fasted. I studied. I attended religious gatherings. I defended what I believed. Whenever someone mentioned Christianity, I already had an answer. Jesus. A prophet. A messenger. A respected figure from history. That was what I believed. Or at least, that was what I thought I believed. Because deep inside me, there was a question I couldn't silence. And it had started with something very simple. Why did Christians speak about Jesus as though he was still alive? I had heard Christians say, Jesus changed my life. Jesus forgave me. Jesus answered my prayer. Jesus is with me. At first, I dismissed those statements. I thought they were simply expressions of religious devotion. But then I met a Christian man named Daniel. He never tried to force me to believe what he believed. He simply told me, Yusuf, if you really want to know who Jesus is, don't only listen to what people say about him. Read his words for yourself. That sentence stayed with me. So I began reading. Quietly. Secretly. I started with the Gospel of Matthew. Then Mark. Then Luke. Then John. And something began happening inside me. The more I read about Jesus, the more questions I had. I expected to find someone I could easily dismiss. Instead, I found a man speaking about forgiveness, mercy, humility, love, sacrifice, and the kingdom of God. One verse particularly troubled me. Jesus said, Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Matthew 11 verse 28. I read those words again. Come unto me. Not simply, study my teaching. Not simply, remember my example. But, come unto me. I couldn't explain why those words affected me. I closed the Bible. But the words followed me. For weeks, I continued searching. And the more I searched, the more unsettled I became. Because I was beginning to realize that my questions weren't going away. They were getting bigger. Then my personal life began falling apart. It did not happen all at once. There was no single morning when everything suddenly collapsed. Instead, it happened slowly, one problem after another, until I realized I was carrying more than I could handle. First, my business suffered a major setback. A deal I had been depending on suddenly fell through. Money I had expected to receive never came. Then another opportunity disappeared. I tried to remain calm. I told myself, it is only temporary. I will recover. I have faced difficulties before. But then the problems started multiplying. Bills continued coming. People who owed me money stopped answering my calls. Expenses increased. And before long, I found myself calculating every amount of money before spending it. There were nights when I would sit alone with my phone in my hand, looking at my bank account and wondering, how did I get here? But I couldn't tell anyone. I was supposed to be strong. People knew me as someone who had answers. Someone who could encourage others. Someone who could tell people to remain patient when life became difficult. But now I was the one struggling. And I was ashamed to admit it. Then something even more painful happened. A close member of my family became seriously ill. At first, we thought it would pass. We expected the doctors to give us medicine and everything would return to normal. But the condition continued. Every phone call brought another concern. Every hospital visit seemed to produce another question. I remember sitting in the hospital one evening, watching my family member lying there. Machines were making quiet sounds around the room. People were moving through the hallway. Doctors were speaking quietly. And I felt completely helpless. I wanted to do something. Anything. But there was nothing I could do to make the situation disappear. That night, I went home carrying a weight I couldn't describe. And somehow, my financial problems no longer seemed like the biggest thing. I was afraid of losing someone I loved. I began sleeping badly. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and immediately remember the situation. I would reach for my phone, check for messages, check for updates, then lie back down and stare at the ceiling. My mind wouldn't stop. What if things get worse? What if the business never recovers? What if my family member doesn't get better? What if tomorrow brings even more bad news? During the day, however, I acted as though everything was fine. I smiled around people. I attended gatherings. I greeted people normally. I answered questions. I laughed when everyone else laughed. If someone asked, "How are you?" I would simply say, "I'm fine." But I wasn't. Inside, I was exhausted. There was a strange emptiness growing inside me. It wasn't simply sadness. It was deeper than that. I could be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. I could be talking to someone and still feel as though my heart was somewhere far away. I could pray, but my mind would wander. I could sleep, but I wouldn't feel rested. I could receive good news, but the happiness never seemed to last. Something was missing. And I didn't know what it was. One night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I sat on the edge of my bed. The room was dark. The only light came from the street outside my window. I looked down at my hands. For several minutes, I said nothing. Then I whispered, "God, why do I feel so empty?" I waited. There was no answer. I tried to pray the way I had always prayed. I repeated words I had known since childhood. But that night, they felt different. My mouth was speaking, but my heart felt distant. I stopped. I tried again. Nothing. I put my hands over my face. Then, unexpectedly, another voice seemed to enter my thoughts. Not an audible voice. A memory. Words I had read weeks earlier. Words I had tried desperately to forget. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I immediately pushed the thought away. No. I whispered it almost angrily. I don't want to think about this. But the words remained. I will give you rest. I opened my eyes. Why was I thinking about Jesus at that moment? Why, when I was surrounded by problems, was my mind returning to something I had been trying to avoid? I stood up and walked across the room. I tried to distract myself. I checked my phone. I looked at messages. I opened social media. But nothing could silence the question. What if I had been searching for peace in all the wrong places? I stopped. Another thought came. What if my heart was hungry for something deeper? I didn't want to answer that question, because answering it honestly could change everything. I knew my family would not understand. I knew my friends would ask questions. I knew people would wonder why I was suddenly reading about Jesus. And I was afraid. Afraid of being misunderstood. Afraid of being rejected. Afraid of what my father would say. Afraid of what my community would think. So I kept everything inside. I carried my questions silently. But the emptiness continued. Then one afternoon, I heard someone talking about traveling to Mecca. The idea immediately caught my attention. At first, I thought it was simply because I needed a change of environment. Maybe getting away from everything would help. Maybe being surrounded by prayer would calm my heart. Maybe I would finally be able to think clearly. So I made the decision. I would travel to Mecca. I told my family I wanted to go and spend time in prayer. Nobody questioned it. To them, it was completely normal. But they didn't know the real reason. I wasn't only going because I wanted to pray. I was going because I was desperate. I wanted to escape the noise inside my own mind. I wanted to stand somewhere quiet and ask God the questions I had been too afraid to ask at home. I wanted to know why my heart felt so empty. I wanted to know why the words of Jesus continued following me. And more than anything else, I wanted an answer. As the day of my journey approached, I became increasingly nervous. I packed my clothes. I prepared everything I needed. But underneath the preparation was another thought. What if nothing changes? What if I traveled all that distance and returned home with the same questions? What if God remained silent? What if I was simply imagining everything? And then another thought frightened me even more. What if God actually answered me? I didn't know what I would do. I didn't know what I would see. I didn't know whether the answer would bring peace or force me to make the most difficult decision of my life. But I knew I could no longer remain where I was. So I made the journey. As the road stretched ahead of me, I looked out through the window. The landscape passed slowly. I thought about my family, my business, the illness, my unanswered prayers, my secret questions, and the words that had been haunting me for weeks. I will give you rest. I closed my eyes. Then I whispered, God, I'm coming because I need you. I paused. And this time, I don't want to hide my questions. I didn't know it then, but I was about to reach the place where I would ask the most honest prayer of my life. I thought I was traveling to Mecca simply to find peace. But deep inside, I was traveling there because I wanted an answer. And when I finally arrived, I had no idea that the answer I was about to encounter would change everything. The journey felt strangely emotional. As I traveled, I kept thinking about everything that had happened during the previous months. My failures, my fears, my questions, my secret Bible reading, my conversations with Daniel, and the question that had followed me everywhere. Who is Jesus really? I tried to push the question away, but I couldn't. When I finally arrived in Mecca, I was overwhelmed by the sight of the crowds. People everywhere. Families. Pilgrims. People praying. People moving with purpose. I had visited before, but this time felt different. I was carrying something nobody else could see. A burden inside my heart. That evening, after spending time in prayer, I found a quieter place where I could sit alone. I lowered my head. I tried to pray. But instead of using the words I had memorized, I spoke from my heart. God. I stopped. My eyes filled with tears. I need an answer. I looked down. I have been afraid to ask. I took a deep breath. I don't know what to believe anymore. For several seconds, I said nothing. Then I whispered, if Jesus is really who Christians say he is. My voice trembled. Show me. I immediately felt frightened by my own words. I looked around. Nobody seemed to notice. I continued. I don't want to follow a lie. I don't want to reject the truth because I'm afraid. God, if Jesus is truly alive. I swallowed. Please let me know. Then I bowed my head. And I waited. Nothing happened. A minute passed. Then another. I almost laughed at myself. What was I expecting? I wiped my eyes. I was about to stand when suddenly, everything around me seemed to become strangely quiet. The sounds of the crowd faded into the background. I could still see people moving, but it was as though I had been separated from the noise. My heart began beating rapidly. I looked up, and that's when I saw him. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I had been sitting there for what felt like hours. My knees were tired. My eyes were heavy. My heart was exhausted from carrying questions I had been afraid to speak aloud. I had prayed. I had cried. I had asked God for an answer. And then, suddenly, I became aware of someone standing several feet away from me. At first, I barely noticed him. There were people moving around. There was noise in the distance. So I assumed he was simply another person passing through. But something made me look again. He was standing completely still. He appeared to be dressed in simple, flowing clothing. There was nothing extravagant about his appearance. Nothing that demanded attention. And yet, I could not look away. Something about his presence was different. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't the kind of presence that made me feel threatened. It was the opposite. There was an extraordinary calmness surrounding him. A peace I had never experienced before. And strangely, that peace frightened me. Because I had spent so many months feeling anxious, confused, exhausted, and empty. Yet suddenly, simply looking at this man made all of that seem to become quiet. My breathing became slower. My thoughts stopped racing. For a moment, I forgot about my business. I forgot about the illness in my family. I forgot about my financial problems. I forgot about the questions that had kept me awake at night. Everything seemed to disappear into the background. I stared at him. His face was peaceful. His eyes seemed filled with compassion. There was no anger in his expression. No condemnation. No accusation. Just mercy. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My mind was desperately trying to understand what I was seeing. I remember thinking, who is this? Then another thought entered my mind. A thought that made my heart stop. Jesus. I immediately looked away. No. I whispered the word almost involuntarily. This can't be happening. I closed my eyes tightly. I told myself that I was exhausted. Perhaps I had been under too much pressure. Perhaps my emotions had overwhelmed me. Perhaps my mind was creating an image because I had been reading so much about Jesus. I kept my eyes closed. For several seconds, I didn't move. Then I slowly opened them. He was still there. My heart began pounding. I looked around to see if anyone else was looking in the same direction. People were moving. Some were talking. Others were focused on their own prayers. Nobody appeared to be reacting to what I was seeing. I looked back at him. He was still standing there. And then something happened that I will never forget. He looked directly at me. Our eyes met. I felt as though the entire world had become silent. I couldn't explain it. It was as though he wasn't merely looking at my face. It felt as though he could see everything inside me. The things I had hidden. The fears I had never told anyone. The questions I had been carrying. The mistakes I regretted. The shame I tried to forget. The loneliness I had experienced even while surrounded by people. Everything. I felt completely exposed. But strangely, I didn't feel condemned. Instead, I felt understood. And that was what broke me. My eyes filled with tears. I tried to hold them back. I couldn't. One tear rolled down my cheek. Then another. I lowered my head. For years, I had been trying to appear strong. I had convinced myself that asking questions was weakness. I had convinced myself that admitting confusion meant failure. I had hidden my fears from my family. I had hidden my doubts from my friends. I had even tried to hide them from God. But standing there, I realized something. I couldn't hide anymore. I whispered, Jesus. My voice was barely audible. I expected an answer. A long explanation. A command. Something dramatic. But he didn't answer with a long speech. He simply continued looking at me with compassion. And somehow, that was enough. I remembered the words I had read before. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. John 14 verse 27. Those words suddenly felt different. I had read them before. But now they seemed alive in my heart. Peace. That was what I had been searching for. Not money. Not success. Not people's approval. Not even an answer to every question. I had been searching for peace. And in that moment, I felt something I couldn't manufacture for myself. The anxiety that had been crushing me seemed to loosen its grip. The fear that had followed me for months became quieter. The heaviness inside my chest began lifting. I started crying. Not because I was terrified. Not because someone had threatened me. Not because I was in danger. I was crying because, for the first time in a very long time, I felt at peace. I covered my face with my hands. The tears wouldn't stop. I whispered, "Why me?" I didn't understand why I was experiencing this. I had so many questions. I wasn't a perfect man. I had made mistakes. I had carried anger. I had judged people. I had allowed pride to control me. And yet, standing there, I felt something I had never expected. Mercy. I began thinking about all the times I had tried to fix my life by myself. When my business struggled, I thought money would solve everything. When my family was hurting, I thought I needed to be strong enough to fix everything. When I felt empty, I tried to distract myself. But none of those things could reach the deepest part of my heart. And now I understood why. My problem wasn't simply my circumstances. My heart was searching for God. I looked at Him again. My voice trembled. "I've been afraid." I paused. "I've been afraid of the truth." Then I whispered, "If you are really Jesus." I struggled to finish the sentence. "Please don't leave me." The tears came again. And in that moment, something changed inside me. I realized that I wasn't standing there trying to win a religious argument. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I wasn't trying to impress anybody. I was simply a broken man asking for mercy. And for the first time, I understood what those words meant. "Come unto me." It wasn't an invitation for perfect people. It was an invitation for people who were tired. People who were broken. People who had questions. People who had nowhere else to turn. People like me. I remained there for what felt like a long time. I didn't know whether minutes had passed or much longer. I simply sat quietly. The peace remained. And then I noticed something. The figure seemed to become less distinct. I blinked. I looked again. He was still there, but it felt as though the brightness surrounding him was changing. I became frightened. "Wait." I whispered. "Please." I didn't want the moment to end. I wanted answers. I wanted to ask about my family. I wanted to ask about my future. I wanted to ask what I was supposed to do next. But before I could say anything else, I felt a deep conviction in my heart. I had already been given the first answer. I had asked God for peace. And I had experienced a peace I could not explain. I had asked God to show me the truth. And now I had to decide whether I was willing to follow wherever that truth led. I wiped my face. I looked again. And suddenly, he was gone. I looked around quickly. My heart began racing. I searched the people nearby. Nothing. No one. I stood up. I looked in every direction. But I couldn't find him. For a moment, I wondered whether I had imagined everything. Then I placed my hand over my chest. My heart was still beating rapidly. But something else was there. Something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. I whispered one final prayer. "Jesus, if that was really you, guide me." I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the future would bring. I didn't know how my family would react. I didn't know what following Jesus would cost me. But as I sat there, tears still running down my face, I knew one thing. I could never go back to pretending I had never searched for him. Because that night, I had come to Mecca asking God for an answer. And I left that moment with something I had been desperately searching for all along. Peace. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But then I heard a gentle voice. "Why are you afraid?" The question seemed to come from somewhere beyond what I could understand. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I looked around. People were still moving. But somehow, the voice seemed to be meant only for me. I couldn't answer immediately. I lowered my head. My mind filled with everything I had been trying to hide. My father. My brothers. My family. My community. The expectations that had shaped my entire life. And the thought of what could happen if they discovered what I had been searching for. Finally, I whispered. "Because I don't know what will happen if I follow the truth." Those words came from the deepest part of me. I wasn't afraid of a debate. I wasn't afraid of someone's criticism. I was afraid of losing the people I loved. I was afraid of becoming a stranger in my own family. I was afraid that the life I had known could disappear. For several moments, there was silence. Then I heard the words, "Do not be afraid to seek the truth." I began trembling. Those words seemed to reach directly into the fear I had been carrying for months. I had been treating my questions as though they were something dangerous. Something I had to bury. Something I had to hide. But now I realized that sincere searching wasn't the same as rebellion. I wasn't trying to hurt my family. I wasn't trying to insult anyone. I simply wanted to know the truth. I looked up again. My eyes were filled with tears. Then I asked the question that frightened me most. What about my family? I thought about my father. I could see his face in my mind. I thought about my mother, my brothers, the people who had raised me, the people who had stood beside me through difficult moments. I couldn't imagine turning my back on them. What am I supposed to do if they reject me? Silence. Then came the words, "Love them." I felt something break inside me. I began crying harder. Not because the answer was complicated. Because it was so simple. Love them. I suddenly realized how wrong my thinking had been. For months, I had imagined that if I ever followed Jesus openly, I would have to fight everyone who disagreed with me. I imagined arguments, anger, division, confrontation. But what I was hearing was completely different. Love, forgiveness, mercy, truth. I remembered the words of Jesus. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you. Matthew 5 verse 44. I understood something I had never understood before. Following Jesus wasn't about becoming better than other people. It wasn't about humiliating those who disagreed with me. It wasn't about winning arguments. It was about allowing God to change my own heart first. I wiped my tears. I looked toward the figure again. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful. Then I noticed something strange. The figure seemed to be fading. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I blinked. I looked again. The light surrounding him seemed brighter. His outline became less distinct. My heart immediately filled with panic. Wait. I reached forward. Please. I didn't want the moment to end. There were so many things I still wanted to ask. I wanted to ask about my family. I wanted to ask about my future. I wanted to ask what I should do when I returned home. I wanted certainty. I wanted a complete explanation. But before I could ask another question, the brightness seemed to increase. And then, he was gone. I remained frozen. For several seconds, I couldn't move. Then the sounds around me suddenly returned. People were walking. Voices could be heard. Footsteps passed nearby. Everything seemed completely normal. It was as though nothing unusual had happened. But I was sitting there completely still. My hands were trembling. My face was wet with tears. I looked around carefully. Nobody seemed to know what had happened. Nobody appeared to have noticed anything unusual. I looked in the direction where the figure had been standing. There was nothing there. I whispered, "Jesus." The word came out almost like a cry. I lowered my head again. For the first time, I understood that the encounter had not answered every question I had. It had created a decision. I had asked God for an answer. Now I had to decide what I would do with what I had experienced. Would I ignore it? Would I convince myself it had never happened? Would I return home and pretend that I was the same person I had been before? Or would I continue searching? I knew one thing. I could no longer pretend that I had no questions. Something inside me had changed. I remembered the first night I had read, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I had once thought those were simply words written on a page. Now they felt personal. I had been carrying a burden. And somehow, in that moment, I had experienced a peace I could not explain. I didn't suddenly understand everything. I still had fears. I still had questions. And I knew difficult days were ahead. but I no longer felt completely alone. I whispered, "God, give me courage." Then I paused. "Give me wisdom." I looked down at my hands. "And help me love my family, no matter what happens." That became my prayer. Not, "Make everyone agree with me." Not, "Make my family understand immediately." But, "Help me love them." I stood slowly. My legs felt weak. I wiped my face and took a deep breath. Then I looked toward the place where I had seen him one final time. And I whispered, "If this was really you, Jesus, guide me." I knew the journey wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. Because I still had to go home. I still had to face my father. I still had to face my family. And I had no idea that someone had already begun to notice that I was changing. Someone had already started asking questions. And when I finally returned home, my secret would no longer remain a secret for much longer. I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The hardest part was going home. Because I had no idea that my family had already begun noticing changes in me. When I returned home, my father looked at me carefully. "You seem different." I forced a smile. "I'm just tired." He continued staring. Then he asked, "Did something happen?" My heart began pounding. No. He didn't believe me. But he didn't press further. Over the next few days, I became quieter. I continued reading the Bible. I prayed. I asked God for wisdom. But I also started treating my family differently. I became more patient. I apologized more quickly. I stopped responding to insults with anger. My father noticed. One evening, he finally asked, "What happened to you?" I looked at him. "Nothing." He shook his head. "No. Something happened." I didn't answer. Then he said something that shocked me. "Your younger brother found something in your room." My heart stopped. "What?" My father reached into his pocket. He pulled out my Bible. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, "Why do you have this?" I knew there was no more hiding. My father placed the Bible on the table. "Are you reading this?" I looked down. "Yes." His face became serious. "Why?" I took a deep breath. "Because I have questions." "Questions about what?" "About Jesus." Silence. My father stood up. "You know what this family believes." "I know." "You know what our community believes." "I know." "Then why are you doing this?" I looked at him. And for the first time, I answered honestly. "Because I don't want to reject the truth simply because I'm afraid of it." He stared at me. I expected anger. I expected shouting. Instead, he became silent. Then he asked, "Did someone convince you to do this?" "No." "Who?" I hesitated. Then I said, "God." He looked confused. "What do you mean?" I told him about my questions. I told him about my struggles. I told him about the night I prayed for an answer. I didn't tell him every detail of what I experienced. Some things were too personal to explain. But I told him this. I asked God to show me the truth. My father sat down. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, "And what did you find?" I looked at him. "I found Jesus." My father didn't suddenly accept everything I said. He had questions. Many questions. And so did I. But something had changed. We were no longer pretending the questions didn't exist. He began asking me what I had read. I showed him passages. We talked. Sometimes we disagreed. Sometimes the conversations became emotional. But I refused to respond with hatred. I remembered the words I had heard. Love them. And slowly, something unexpected happened. My father began reading too. Not because I forced him. Not because I argued him into it. Because he wanted to understand what had changed his son. Weeks became months. Our conversations continued. And then one evening, my father walked into my room. He was holding the Bible. He looked at me. Then he said, "Read this passage to me." I knew immediately that something had changed. He wasn't asking me to defend myself anymore. He was searching. And I realized that perhaps the greatest miracle wasn't what I had experienced in Mecca. Perhaps the greatest miracle was that a question had entered our entire family. A question nobody could silence. Who is Jesus? Looking back, I realized that my journey didn't begin with a spectacular encounter. It began with a question. It began with uncertainty. It began with a simple prayer. God, show me the truth. And I learned something important. Sometimes God doesn't answer us in the way we expect. Sometimes the answer begins with a question. Sometimes the miracle begins with a changed heart. Sometimes the person who is searching for God doesn't realize that God is already drawing them closer. And sometimes, the answer you've been afraid to ask for is the very answer that can transform your entire life. Maybe you're watching this right now and you're carrying your own unanswered question. Maybe you've been praying for years. Maybe you are struggling with fear. Maybe your family doesn't understand you. Maybe you feel completely alone. Maybe you're asking, does God really hear me? I want to encourage you. Keep seeking. Keep praying. Don't be afraid to bring your questions honestly before God. Jesus said, "Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you." Matthew 7 verse 7. And Scripture says, "Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and mighty things, which thou knowest not." Jeremiah 33 verse 3. Your answer may not come exactly when you expect it. Your miracle may not look exactly like someone else's. But don't give up. And if you are watching this and you have a prayer request, please don't hesitate to share it in the comments. Whatever you're going through, family problems, financial struggles, sickness, fear, loneliness, unanswered prayers, write it down. We will pray together. Also tell us. Globe showing Europe Africa, what country or region are you watching from? Alarm clock, what exact time are you watching this testimony? Calendar, what year are you watching? Someone reading your comment may realize, I'm not the only one going through this. And if you believe Jesus still changes lives today, take a moment to subscribe and join this growing family of faith. And stay with us, because there are more stories of faith, hope, transformation, and the love of Jesus still to come. I went to Mecca asking God for an answer. I expected certainty. I expected a solution. I expected something that would remove every question from my mind. Instead, I encountered something that forced me to ask an even greater question. Not, what do I want to believe? But, am I willing to follow the truth wherever it leads? That question changed me. And perhaps that's where your journey begins too. Because sometimes, the greatest miracle isn't that God changes your circumstances. Sometimes, He changes your heart first. Sometimes the answer doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly. Through a verse. Through a prayer. Through a conversation. Through a moment when you finally stop running from the questions inside you. And sometimes, the person who asks God for an answer discovers that the answer has been calling them all along. If you are searching today, don't give up. If you are hurting, keep praying. If you are afraid, keep seeking. If you have questions, bring them honestly before God. And if you have encountered Jesus, don't be ashamed to seek Him. Because the one you are searching for may be closer than you ever imagined. Keep seeking. Keep praying. Keep believing. And never forget. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Romans 8 verses 38 to 39. God bless you.